Good morning. It is wonderful to see everyone this morning. I'm glad that despite all that has blown our way last week, the building still stands. If you want to avoid following a lot of rules, I would not suggest you ever work in the finance industry. It is second only to the medical industry in terms of how much regulation, how many rules are imposed upon it. And many of those rules, at least in theory, are designed to help the people who work in the finance industry avoid what they often refer to as conflicts of interest. Basically, what that means is, for example, if you are trying to help someone invest, let's say in a stock or a mutual fund, something like that, if you are suggesting a certain mutual fund that maybe gives you a bit more commission, well, then you might be incentivized to suggest that one simply because it gives you more commission, even if it's not the best for your client. There's a lot of different rules and regulations that are put in place that are designed to try and prevent those kinds of things, to try and keep you as the person working in that industry from putting yourself and your interest before what should be the primary focus, which is the interest of the client. We've been looking, if you've been here for the last couple weeks, at 1 Timothy chapter 3 and Titus 1 as the description is given of the type of men that elders in the church should be. And in those lists, we've talked about several different things so far, but this morning I want to focus on this idea of conflicts of interest, on things that Paul says in 1 Timothy and in Titus that are conflicts of interest between the job of an elder and what else they could find themselves pursuing in life. And what we're going to see, I'm quite sure, as we move through, is that these aren't just conflicts of interest for elders specifically. These are things that are conflicts of interest if we fall into this trap for all Christians. All of the things we're going to look at this morning are things that create a problem where we're pulled in two directions, either pursuing God and His will or pursuing something else that is ultimately focused on ourselves. As we begin, let's go ahead and read a couple of verses in 1 Timothy 3 and Titus chapter 1. Starting in 1 Timothy 3 and verse 3. This is describing who an elder or an overseer should be. Paul says, not a drunkard, not violent, but gentle, not quarrelsome, not a lover of money. And go down to verse 6. He must not be a recent convert, or he may become puffed up with conceit and fall into the condemnation of the devil. If you turn over a couple pages to Titus chapter 1, we have a similar list, if you will, given in verse 7. For an overseer or elder, as God's steward, must be above reproach. We talked about that a couple weeks ago. He must not be arrogant or quick-tempered, or a drunkard or violent or greedy for gain. What do these things have in common? And how exactly do they relate to not only elders, but all Christians? First of all, let's think about this idea of not being a drunkard. That's typically the word as it is translated here, and there's actually a lot of debate, you might be surprised to learn, about exactly what this word means. I think in the New King James, the King James is translated not given to wine or not given to much wine or something like that, which of course spawned all sorts of discussions. Well, is he saying not any wine? Is he saying not much wine? What all? And we could go into that discussion. That's a topic for another time, honestly, because it misses the point, as is often the case with these discussions about the qualities that elders should possess. The idea here is not on how much alcohol, if any, is appropriate for an elder or any Christian to consume. The idea is about the mind. Essentially, what Paul is trying to emphasize is the mind of someone in this position clear and able to focus on the responsibility, or has it been compromised? And that's a question we should be asking ourselves as Christians in any capacity. Is my mind clear or compromised? Think about this. Why is it that drunk driving is such a problem in our society? Why is it an issue? I don't mean the statistics on how many people get killed because of drunk driving. I mean, why does driving while intoxicated cause a problem? Well, the answer is very simple. It causes a problem because when you are intoxicated, your mind is not able to be alert and process the things that you need to do and the decisions you need to make in operating a vehicle. And so you're much more likely to make a mistake, which could tragically end someone's life. And yet, this can actually go far beyond alcohol specifically in terms of the effect that many things can have on our ability to be alert, our ability to be focused, our ability to have our minds set on what they need to be. In Galatians chapter 5, verses 22 and 23, we have the fruits of the Spirit listed, as we often call them, as Paul himself titles them, right? The fruits of the Spirit: love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, self-control. That last one is the one I want to focus on for just a second. Self-control. What does that mean, self-control? Well, duh, preacher, it means control of yourself, right? It's in the name, it's in the word. But how do I do that? How can I control myself? I mean, technically, we could say every decision that I make, I have control over. It's a decision, after all. It's a choice. But there are things I can do to minimize my ability to control myself. I can remember many times, especially in college and things like that, where I would be really tired. I stayed up till 2 o'clock, had to get up at like 7 to go to an 8 o'clock class. I was exhausted. When you're tired, you're not as alert, you're not as focused, you make mistakes. There's a reason why they tell you to get good sleep the night before a test. Whenever, this was especially when I was younger, I bet mom and dad can attest to this, whenever I'd eat a lot of sugar, I wasn't in control of myself when I was growing up sometimes. I would bounce off the walls. There's a lot of things that we can do that minimize our mind's ability to be alert, to be focused, to be in control. Certainly alcohol is one of them. Might throw drugs in that category. There's other things. There are various forms of addiction that have nothing to do with substances that can create a conflict of interest, create a compromise in our mind where we're not able to control what we're doing as well. In 1 Thessalonians chapter 5 and verse 6, here as he is warning the Thessalonians they need to be ready, he says, you don't need to be like the ones who sleep. You need to be awake and alert. What does that mean? It means our minds as Christians, not specifically as elders or any kind of leadership position, but as Christians, we need to be alert. We need to be focused. We need to have our minds cleared of distractions so that we can focus on serving God. But it's very easy to let distractions come in. It's very easy to allow the things of this world, whatever they may be, to interfere with the clarity of our minds. In Matthew chapter 22 and verse 37, Jesus says the greatest commandment is to love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, with all your strength. Now I ask you, brethren, how can I love God with all my mind if I am mentally compromised? How can I love God with all my mind if my mind is split in two different directions? There are so many distractions. There are so many things that cripple our minds that we can allow in if we're not careful. Even things that are good. Even things that are wholesome in a certain scenario, in a certain degree, we can allow to grow out of hand. Things like entertainment, things like things we do for fun, hobbies, whatever the case might be, they can take up so much of our minds that all of a sudden we become more focused on them than on what we should be doing for God. As I think we can see, not being a drunkard encompasses a lot more in principle than a lot of times we reduce it down to. How can I love God with all my mind if I'm mentally compromised? But let's move on in this list because there are several things that we want to look at this morning, all conflicts of interest, if you will, between what God wants us to do and what we often want to do. Go back to 1 Timothy chapter 3. He says in verse 3 that an elder does not need to be a lover of money. Some translations might more literally say a lover of silver, which of course is the same idea. In Titus chapter 1 and verse 7, again he says he must not be greedy for gain. And even in some translations you have both a lover of money and greedy for gain, depending on your translation in this verse. That brings us to another question. What am I trying to gain? For those who are in a position of leadership, and that's not limited to elders, especially in our culture, it would extend to preachers or deacons or different things like that as well. What am I trying to gain? All of us have seen or heard of people who make a business out of proclaiming at least what they claim is the gospel. Whether it be on television or on the internet or whatever it might be, whatever the scenario, there are people who make literally millions or even billions of dollars off of the proclamation of the gospel. There was a whole scandal, I guess it was only a few months ago now, where one famous televangelist was telling everyone that God had told him he needed a bigger private jet than the one he already had so that he could do the work that he needed to do. It's quite clear from the lives of many that they're trying to gain something that has nothing to do with spiritual focus. It has nothing to do with God's kingdom. It has to do with their pocketbook. In fact, when you look in the New Testament, Paul himself was often accused of having just such a motivation. In 1 Corinthians chapter 9, he has to clarify, it is not wrong for me to be supported financially in what I'm doing. He goes into great detail about this, saying the rights that he has in that regard. But then he says, listen, I haven't taken advantage of those rights because I don't want to give any kind of impression whatsoever that that's why I do this. I am doing this solely for the purpose of spreading the kingdom of God. In John chapter 12 and verse 6, we see the contrast with that. Of course, Paul and Judas never crossed paths that we know of, but Judas demonstrated a very different set of priorities. We're told in chapter 12 of John that when the woman comes and anoints Jesus' feet with that very expensive ointment, that Judas in particular was upset, saying this should have been sold and the money given to the poor, because he was the one who kept the pouch of money, if you will, for the group. And he used to help himself every once in a while. He was trying to gain something more than following Christ. And actually, all the apostles ultimately, as we see in their motivations, seemed to have an ulterior motive in following Christ, at least at first, because they understood Christ to be coming to set up a physical kingdom. And they wanted to be his inner circle. They wanted to be his subordinates, if you will, the ones who were directly under him governing this new kingdom. We even have the sons of Zebedee coming and asking with their mother to be on the right hand and the left hand of Jesus when he established what they assumed would be his earthly kingdom. They were trying to gain something very specific. And yet that's not at all what we are called to do, either as any kind of leader in the church, but even as Christians in general. You know, you might think that there's nothing about Christianity that would allow us to gain anything unless maybe you are a televangelist or something like that, but that's not the case, certainly not in our culture. There are ways that you can gain, not necessarily even financially. In many places, especially in the South, you just have a better reputation if you show up to church at least every once in a while. Gain social status. Certainly there are people who probably some of us even are familiar with who have taken advantage of the church and their generosity to try and gain financially. That actually, tragically, makes it more difficult for those who are truly in need, because so many try and take advantage. In Hebrews chapter 13 and verse 5, We're told to keep our lives free from the love of money. Money is a wonderful tool, like we just talked about in the last point. There are many things that are good insofar as they go that if we take them outside of where they were intended, they become not only dangerous, they can completely derail us from what we are supposed to do for Christ. Keep our lives free from the love of money. It doesn't say keep your lives free from money. Money can be a wonderful thing. There are many works that we support. There are many people who are studying, for example, to be ministers or who are in foreign fields proclaiming the gospel. We use money to help them. But the love of money, that's a different story. If I'm a Christian for earthly gain, in any kind of sense, I will find myself in spiritual poverty. We talk about, I know I've had several conversations even with y'all, how much of a blessing it is to have the church. Because when hard times happen, you have someone to fall back on. But that's not why we're Christians. We're not Christians so we have an insurance policy. We know that we have someone to back us up if we lose our home or something like that. That's a wonderful blessing of being a Christian. But that's not why. And if I'm a Christian for earthly gain, for that purpose, I'm going to find myself in spiritual poverty. Not greedy for money, not a lover of money or lover of silver, as Paul would say. But thirdly, going back again to 1 Timothy chapter 3. Here he says, an elder, specifically, but even more so, verse 6, anyone who is a Christian. He must not be a recent convert, but that's not for any reason, that's for a specific reason. Or he may become puffed up with conceit and fall into the condemnation of the devil. In Titus 1, again, something very similar. He must not be arrogant. In other words, is my focus on self or is my focus on others? I might have used this example before. If so, I'm using it again. If you've ever seen the movie Gladiator, interesting movie. There's certainly some violent scenes in it, but interesting movie in terms of a setting in the time shortly after the time of Christ in the Roman Empire. There is a point in time where you have the current emperor approaching one of his generals. This emperor knows his son should never be in the position of emperor. He wants that to go instead to this general. He wants his general to take over as emperor. The general is not in any way a politician. He's a very down-to-earth man. He has no desire for fame or power. And so when the emperor asks him if he will take on that responsibility, Maximus, the general, answers, "With all my heart, no." And the emperor's response is quite telling. He says, "Maximus, that is why it must be you. The reason it has to be you is because you don't want it. Because anyone who does want it has the wrong motivation. Only someone who is selfless, not interested in the power, the prestige, can do what needs to be done in this position." That's what Paul is saying about those who would be leaders in the church, elders specifically. Their focus cannot be on themselves. It has to be on others. In Matthew chapter 23, again, we have the opposite of that. We have this long list of problems that Jesus points out with the leaders of his day, the religious leaders among the Jews. In verses 5 through 8 in particular, he talks about how everything they do is focused not on those they are supposed to be leading and serving. Instead, it's focused on self. They love the greetings in the marketplaces. They love for people to call them Rabbi, Rabbi, recognizing their position, giving them the respect that they believe they deserve. That is not at all what a leader in the Lord's church is supposed to be. Instead, Jesus, after stooping down to the level of a servant and washing his disciples' feet, says, this is the kind of leader, this is the kind of person I want to be great in my kingdom. The one who would be a servant. The one who would lower themselves even to serve in the most menial of ways. That is the great. That is the leader. That is the noble in my kingdom. In Philippians chapter 2 and verse 3, Paul expresses this, even alluding to Christ again himself, saying, let nothing be done through selfish ambition or conceit, but in lowliness of mind, let each esteem others better than himself. That's where our focus should be. Especially in leadership positions in any situation, but including in the church. Whether it be elders or deacons or preachers or even just people who happen to have some kind of status in the community, it can be easy, very easy for us to become focused on ourselves. That was the case in 3 John when you have the individual there who, Diotrephes, he was trying to make everything about himself. We don't know if he was even a leader in the church at all. He could have been an elder or something like that, but he might have just been a member who was trying to leverage his situation for his own benefit. None of us are immune to making things about ourselves. None of us are immune to putting ourselves above others as Christians, but that again is a conflict of interest. Because we are called to put Christ before all and others before self. In Luke chapter 17 and verse 10, we're told exactly the attitude that we should have. When we have done everything that God has told us to do, we approach him and say, Lord, I am so thankful that I'm not like these other people. I have done all that you have asked me. No, that's a different story, right? No, when we have done all that we are called to do, Jesus said in Luke chapter 17 and verse 10, we are to say, I'm an unprofitable servant. In other words, I'm worthless to you. All I've done is what was my duty. That's our attitude. It's so important in all of these areas, for leaders in particular, but for Christians in general, to not allow such distractions, such conflicts to pull us away from how we should be serving the Lord. And this comes down to how we think. Because the simple truth is, I will never put others above myself if I believe that I am superior. Whether socially, whether because of my skill or my wealth or whatever the case might be. Even if I never express that I believe I'm better than someone else, if I believe it, I'm never going to put others before myself. It starts with the heart. And that is something that all of us as Christians must be very careful of. I will never put others above myself if I believe I'm superior. But lastly, let's return to 1 Timothy chapter 3. He says, in this list, an elder should not be violent, but gentle, not quarrelsome. In Titus chapter 1, in verse 7, he says he must not be quick-tempered or violent. Again, similar words being used in both of these lists. Now, for us, violence has a very specific meaning. We read this, we say, okay, an elder must not be a serial killer. Cool. It's not what we're talking about, is it? Violence is not the idea of physical violence necessarily. Here we're talking about something a bit different. Quarrelsome might help us get in the right direction a little more. The idea is, how do I handle conflict? How do I handle conflict? You might have seen on Facebook or something like that. I don't even know where it started originally, but you have the guy sitting at the table with this little tablecloth and it has written on it, blah, 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 change my mind. I don't know what the first thing was that someone did with that, but now we've made all sorts of memes and things about it online. The earth is flat, change my mind. I don't know. Now, I don't know originally what the intent was with that. Most people, when they use that, use it as a way of, hey, let's start an argument. And granted, usually it's about dumb stuff and it's not meant seriously, but that can very easily become our mindset, especially in the church. Now, we understand, as we've talked about many times, we are to be willing always to give an answer for the hope that is in us, as Peter tells us. But that's not what we're talking about here. In fact, we actually addressed that a couple weeks ago. That is talking specifically when we are being pressed, not when we're seeking out conflict, when we're being pressed for an answer. Why are you doing what you're doing? There's a big difference between standing for the truth and looking to pick fights. And yet, both as leaders in the church and as Christians, it's very easy for us to get into the habit of picking fights. In 1 Peter chapter 5 and verse 3, actually talking specifically about elders, Peter says that elders are not to domineer over those who are in their charge. In other words, they're not to be bullies. I'm very thankful that the elders here in no way have ever come off like that, but I have known, and you yourselves might have known, elders that have used their position, not here but elsewhere, used their position to bully, used their position to pick fights, used their position not for the betterment of the church, but for the promotion of themselves as people who are never wrong. In Romans chapter 14, Paul helps us to understand how we should handle conflicts in the church. Ultimately, a big part of our standard should revolve around what Paul says there. Who am I to judge another's servant? Before his own master he stands or falls. Now don't misunderstand, there are many other passages that help us see we are supposed to help our brother or our sister who is going into sin. That doesn't mean we don't call them out on their sin. It means we are not the judge. We are not the ones who get to make the rules, and we're not the ones who get to say, oh, this is right and this is wrong. God is the one who says this is right and this is wrong. We encourage one another by sharing those truths, but we don't set ourselves up as the judge. In fact, in Titus chapter 3 and verse 10, just a couple of chapters later than when he addresses elders in chapter 1, Paul tells Titus, you reject a divisive man, one who is spreading division, not one who is standing for the truth or trying to remain sound for the truth, but one who is picking fights, one who is bullying his fellow Christians. You reject them. After warning them that what they're doing is wrong, which, by the way, helps us understand we are to warn when people are doing wrong. But if they insist on sowing division among brethren, you reject them. That is completely the opposite of how a Christian should behave. And again, it's not just leaders, not just elders or even deacons or preachers or others. Anyone can pick fights in the name of standing for truth or something like that. Anyone can be a bully spiritually. In Ephesians chapter 4 and verse 15, a verse we really need to focus on more sometimes. We're told to speak the truth in love. Not if you're speaking the truth, you're being loving. Speak the truth in love. Those are two things that need to go together. But I can speak the truth in a very unloving manner. And I can be loving while ignoring what's not true. They have to go together. Either one without the other is not right. Many people use the church as an excuse to pick fights and to bully others. But that's another conflict of interest. All of us are called to do what God commands us, to live as Christ gave us an example. And that means, in all of these areas that we've talked about this morning, we have to make sure we aren't actually putting our focus, putting our priority on something that maybe in the name of serving Christ is actually pulling us away from his will. We have to allow ourselves to be alert and keep our minds clear for what he calls us to apply it to. We have to make sure we're trying to gain an earthly treasure, not anything in this life. Make sure our focus is not on ourselves, but on others, on Christ ultimately. We have to make sure that when there is conflict, and conflict will arise, we handle it as we are instructed to by Christ, and not as we have grown accustomed to, perhaps, among those who instead use such situations for their own devices. Are you holding on to a conflict of interest this morning? Are you allowing something in your life that's pulling you away from your focus on God? As we've been talking about the last few weeks, this is not by any means exclusive to those who serve as elders. This is given of elders specifically because elders who do not meet these qualities will cause even greater harm, but any Christian who fails in these areas will cause harm. Are you making sure your life is free from the conflict of interests that are described in these passages? If there's something we can do to help you, perhaps an area that we've talked about this morning that you're struggling with, we always stand ready to pray, to study, to help one another. Please let us know if we can help as we stand and sing.